At just 14 years old, Claire Miller walked into the courtroom clutching an oversized folder, ready to defend her father. The bank had labeled him a failure, and their smug attorney dismissed her as a child out of her depth. But Claire's determined gaze hit a fire no one expected. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. But let's start at the beginning. The small courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the sound of whispered conversations bouncing softly off the paneled wood walls and polished floors. It was the kind of atmosphere one would expect in a place where lives could be irrevocably altered by a few words. At the center of it all sat George Miller, a weary-looking man in his mid-40s. His slumped posture and the deep lines etched across his pale face told a story of long, sleepless nights and the crushing weight of worry. His once neatly trimmed brown hair now bore streaks of gray, and his tired blue eyes stared blankly at the table in front of him. Dressed in a rumpled gray suit that didn't quite fit, perhaps borrowed or simply a relic from better days, George looked like a man on the verge of collapse. He wasn't just fighting to keep his home, he was fighting for the remnants of his dignity, his family's stability, and everything he had worked his whole life to protect. And yet, the most unusual part of this trial wasn't the stakes. It was the defender he had brought to the courtroom, his 14-year-old daughter, Claire Miller. The room fell quieter as Claire entered, clutching an overstuffed folder of documents to her chest with both hands. All eyes turned to her, and the skeptical glances were impossible to ignore. She was small for her age, with fair skin and long, chestnut brown hair pulled into a low ponytail that swayed as she walked. She wore a modest outfit, a light blue cardigan over a white blouse, paired with a simple navy skirt and scuffed black shoes. Her youthful face betrayed her nerves, her lips pressed tightly together, her brow furrowed in concentration, but her hazel eyes burned with a quiet determination that didn't belong on someone so young. What could a child possibly contribute here? The audience whispered. Some chuckled softly, others exchanged doubtful looks, and a few shook their heads outright. A man in the back row, a balding 35-year-old with pale skin and wire-rimmed glasses, leaned over to his neighbor, a woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair, and muttered, "This is going to be over in minutes." Claire ignored them. Her grip on the folder tightened as she approached the defendant's table. Her father looked up at her, his weary expression softening for just a moment as she sat beside him. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, to give her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. She placed her folder on the table and carefully began organizing its contents, her small hands moving with purpose. At the front of the room, Judge Harry Thompson observed the scene with a raised eyebrow. A man of 55, with dark brown skin, short-cropped gray hair, and a clean-shaven face, Thompson was known for his no-nonsense demeanor and razor-sharp intellect. His black judicial robes hung neatly over his broad shoulders, and his steely gaze scanned the courtroom. His lips pursed as he leaned slightly forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Ms. Miller," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the murmurs, silencing them instantly. "Do I understand correctly that you intend to represent your father in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor," Claire replied, her voice soft but clear. She stood as she spoke, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. A faint ripple of laughter came from the gallery, brief, stifled, and quickly quelled by a sharp glance from the judge. Thompson's expression didn't waver, though a flicker of curiosity crossed his sharp features. "And you are... how old, young lady?" "I'm 14, Your Honor," Claire said, straightening her posture. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't falter. 14. The judge repeated, his tone unreadable. He glanced down at his notes, his expression remaining neutral. "This is highly irregular." The opposing attorney, seated at a polished oak table across the room, stood with a confident smirk. He was a 40-year-old man with pale skin, slicked back blonde hair, and a navy suit that looked custom-tailored to perfection. Adjusting his tie, he cleared his throat and said, "Your Honor, I feel obligated to point out that this is a waste of the court's time. With all due respect, the defendant is clearly desperate and—" "That's enough, Mr. Carter," Judge Thompson interrupted, his sharp gaze cutting across the room. Carter's smirk faded, and he sat back down, though his expression remained smug as he scribbled something on a legal pad. The judge returned his attention to Claire, studying her carefully. The room hung in tense silence, every spectator waiting for him to dismiss her. But then, to everyone's surprise, he said, "Ms. Miller, the law allows for self-representation. There is no rule barring you from speaking on behalf of your father. However, I must warn you, this court has little patience for theatrics or emotional appeals without substance. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Claire said firmly. Her hands were still gripping the table, but she lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze head-on. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of Thompson's mouth, a reaction so subtle that it might have been imagined. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to proceed. "Very well. Let's hear what you have to say." The murmurs in the gallery returned, louder this time, as people exchanged shocked glances. Some leaned forward in their seats, suddenly intrigued. George Miller straightened slightly in his chair, his lined face softening with the smallest flicker of hope. Claire took a deep breath, her hands shaking just a little as she opened her folder and pulled out the first document. The courtroom lights cast a warm glow over the scene, making the polished wood and muted tones of the room feel both oppressive and solemn. Despite her size, despite the odds stacked against her, Claire Miller looked every bit like someone ready to take on the fight of her life. And though the room was filled with doubt, there was something about her quiet resolve that made it impossible to look away. When the proceedings began, the tension in the courtroom felt almost tangible, like the weight of an invisible hand pressing down on everyone present. Judge Harry Thompson sat at the center of it all, his commanding presence amplified by his dark judicial robes and piercing gaze. A man of 55, with dark brown skin and short, neatly trimmed gray hair, he was known for his unflinching demeanor and sharp intellect. His hands rested on the bench, fingers interlocked, as he observed Claire Miller rise from her seat with a neutral, almost detached expression. Claire, only 14 years old, looked impossibly small as she stood behind the defendant's table. Her fair skin seemed even paler under the harsh lighting of the courtroom, and her long, chestnut-brown hair, tied back in a simple ponytail, swayed slightly as she adjusted her position. She wore a light blue cardigan over a plain white blouse, paired with a navy skirt that stopped just above her knees. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the table, her knuckles white with tension. From his high vantage point, Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow, his sharp features betraying a flicker of skepticism. This was not the first time he had presided over an unconventional case, but a teenage girl speaking in defense of her father? That was a rarity, even for him. His deep, resonant voice cut through the murmurs in the room. "You may proceed, Ms. Miller," he said, his tone laced with a hint of impatience. The gallery behind her was packed with spectators, their curiosity heightened by the sheer absurdity of the situation. Some leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the inevitable collapse, while others exchanged amused glances. A 40-year-old man with slicked-back blonde hair, the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, sat at his table with a smirk tugging at the corners of his pale face. Dressed in a pristine navy suit, he scribbled something on his legal pad, glancing at Claire as if she were nothing more than an amusing sideshow. Claire opened her mouth, but the first word caught in her throat. A faint, audible exhale betrayed her nerves. For a brief moment, the room felt on the verge of erupting into laughter, but then she began to speak. "My father is not a criminal," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. Her hazel eyes scanned the room, meeting Judge Thompson's gaze before settling on the gallery. "He's a victim of a broken system that failed him and our family." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing the whispers and stifled chuckles. Even Mr. Carter looked up from his notes, his smirk fading into a frown of mild surprise. Judge Thompson tilted his head, his expression unreadable. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench as if daring her to continue. Claire took a shaky breath and pushed forward. "For years, my father worked tirelessly to support our family. He never asked for help even when things got hard. But when the factory closed and jobs disappeared, he did what anyone would do. He tried to keep us afloat. The loans, the bills, they piled up faster than he could manage. And instead of helping, the system turned its back on him." Her voice, though still tinged with youth, carried a conviction that no one had expected. Her words were not rehearsed platitudes. They came from a place of raw, unfiltered truth. George Miller, seated beside her, looked at his daughter with an expression that mixed pride and heartbreak. His 45-year-old face, lined with exhaustion, seemed to soften as he listened to her defend him. He adjusted the loose gray suit jacket that hung awkwardly on his thin frame, his hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to her words for strength. In the gallery, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. A woman in her early 50s with tan skin and curly dark brown hair who had been whispering with her neighbor moments ago now sat motionless, her lips pressed tightly together. A younger man, about 25 years old with dark brown skin and short curls, leaned forward in his seat, his previously neutral expression now filled with intrigue. Claire continued, her voice gaining strength. "We are not asking for pity. We are not asking for handouts. We are asking for fairness, for the same opportunity that anyone else would deserve in our situation. My father doesn't deserve to lose everything, because the system that should protect people like him chose to ignore him instead." Judge Thompson's stern gaze remained fixed on Claire, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. His hands moved from the bench to his lap, his fingers tapping lightly against one another. His sharp features, which often intimidated even seasoned attorneys, softened ever so slightly, though he said nothing. The silence in the room was deafening as Claire paused, her chest rising and falling with the effort it took to steady her breathing. The tension was broken only by the faint sound of paper rustling as Mr. Carter flipped through his notes, his confident demeanor now replaced with a look of slight unease. "Ms. Miller," Judge Thompson finally said, his deep voice cutting through the silence, "you've made some strong claims. Do you have evidence to support them?" Without hesitation, Claire nodded. She reached down, opening the overstuffed folder she had placed on the table. The edges of her lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, not one of triumph, but of quiet determination. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I've prepared everything." The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as she pulled out the first document, placing it on the table with care. Her small hands, no longer trembling, moved with precision as she laid out her case. In that moment, the courtroom transformed. Claire Miller, the timid teenager who had walked into the room under a cloud of doubt and derision, now commanded the attention of everyone present. Her voice, though young, carried the weight of someone far older, and her unwavering resolve left even the harshest critics wondering if they had underestimated her. For Judge Thompson, it was no longer a question of whether Claire could speak. It was a question of what she might say next. Claire stood tall behind the defendant's table, her small hands resting on the edge for balance. The dim light of the courtroom cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the determined glint in her hazel eyes. She paused for a moment, her chest rising and falling as she gathered herself. When she began to speak, her words flowed with the kind of raw, unpolished honesty that demanded the room's attention. "My father isn't a failure," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. He's a man who has worked tirelessly for everything we have, or at least what we used to have." She glanced at George, seated beside her. His 45-year-old face was lined with exhaustion, his pale skin a testament to the stress that had eroded him over the years. His graying brown hair was unkempt, and his ill-fitting gray suit hung loosely on his thin frame, as if the weight of his struggles had shrunk him over time. Claire took a deep breath, gripping the table a little tighter. "My dad used to work at a factory," she continued, her voice growing steadier. "He worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes more, to make sure we had food on the table and a roof over our heads. He was proud of his job, proud to be able to provide for us. But then one day, it was all gone. The factory shut down, and with it went every bit of stability we'd ever known." The room was utterly silent, save for the faint creak of a chair in the gallery as someone shifted uncomfortably. Judge Harry Thompson, a 55-year-old black man with dark brown skin, short gray hair, and a sharp, clean-shaven face, leaned forward slightly. Known for his stoicism and no-nonsense demeanor, he rarely showed emotion during proceedings. But now, there was a faint crease in his brow, and his deep-set eyes darted briefly to George, as if weighing the humanity of the man before him against the cold facts of the case. Claire's voice trembled slightly as she pressed on. "After the layoffs, my dad did everything he could to keep us going. He applied for jobs everywhere, factories, warehouses, even grocery stores, but no one was hiring. And when things got really hard, he took out loans. Not because he wanted to," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "but because he had to. He was trying to protect us, to keep us from losing everything." George lowered his head, his fingers clasped tightly in his lap. His shoulders were hunched, and his tired blue eyes stared at the table as if it held all the answers he'd been searching for. For a man who had spent years doing everything in his power to protect his family, sitting here, powerless, while his daughter fought his battle was almost too much to bear. In the gallery, the expressions of those who had come to watch shifted noticeably. A middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair, who had earlier been whispering dismissively to her neighbor, now sat with her lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze was fixed on Claire, her expression softened by something that looked like empathy. A younger man, about 25 years old with dark brown skin and short curls, leaned forward in his seat, his arms resting on his knees as he listened intently. Claire's voice grew quieter as she reached the most painful part of her story. "My dad, he skipped meals so my little brother and I could eat. He pretended he wasn't hungry. He'd say he already ate, but I knew it wasn't true. He just didn't want us to worry." Her hazel eyes glistened as she looked down at the table, blinking quickly to hold back tears. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, but it wasn't the dismissive chatter from before. It was softer now, a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of her words. Even the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, a 40-year-old white man with pale skin and slicked-back blonde hair, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His previously smug demeanor faltered as he scribbled on his notepad, avoiding eye contact with the young girl who had captured the room's attention. Claire looked up again, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. "We've already lost so much. And now, because of a system that cares more about money than people, we're about to lose our home too. All we want is a chance. Just one chance to show that my dad isn't the man they're trying to make him out to be." Judge Thompson's sharp features remained neutral, but his eyes lingered on George a moment longer than before. There was something in the way he looked, an almost imperceptible softening, as though Claire's words had pierced through the carefully constructed walls he kept between himself and the cases before him. He cleared his throat and straightened in his seat, his hands resting firmly on the bench. Claire's voice wavered again, but she didn't stop. "My dad isn't perfect. He's made mistakes. But those mistakes don't define him. What defines him is how hard he's fought for us. how much he sacrificed just to give us a chance. The courtroom remained silent as Claire finished speaking, her chest rising and falling with the effort of keeping her emotions in check. George finally lifted his head, his tired blue eyes glistening with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He looked at Claire, his expression a mixture of pride and heartbreak, as though he couldn't believe the strength of the young girl standing before him. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken emotions, before Judge Thompson finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a faint, almost imperceptible warmth in his tone. "Thank you, Miss Miller," he said. "You've made your position clear. Please continue." For the first time since the proceedings began, it felt as though the tide was shifting. And it was all because of Claire, a 14-year-old girl whose raw honesty and unshakable determination had done what no one in that room had thought possible. She made them care. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Claire Miller, standing behind the defendant's table, continued her impassioned plea. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table for balance, her chestnut-brown ponytail swaying slightly as she leaned forward to emphasize her words. Her fair face, though youthful, carried an intensity that made everyone in the room sit up a little straighter. She wasn't just speaking. She was fighting, pouring her heart into every word. But as she spoke about her father's sacrifices and the crushing weight of their struggles, the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, rose from his seat. A 40-year-old white man with pale skin and slicked-back blonde hair, he exuded an air of polished confidence. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, he adjusted his tie with deliberate precision before addressing the court. "Your Honor," Carter began, his tone clipped and condescending, "while this young lady's story is certainly heartfelt, it doesn't change the facts of the case. George Miller defaulted on his payments. The numbers don't lie. He willingly entered into an agreement, and when he failed to uphold his end of the bargain, the bank had every right to act." The words were cold, clinical, and calculated, designed to dismantle the emotional weight of Claire's testimony. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, and a few skeptical glances were exchanged among the spectators. Claire's hands tightened on the table's edge, her knuckles whitening as she stared at Carter. For a moment, she said nothing, the room falling silent except for the faint rustling of papers on the attorney's table. The audience waited, expecting the teenager to falter under the weight of such a pointed rebuttal. But then, she spoke. "Have you ever seen someone willingly choose to lose everything they've worked for?" Claire's voice rang out, steady and sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Heads turned, and all eyes fixed on her, their previous skepticism replaced with astonishment. Even Judge Harry Thompson, seated at the bench, tilted his head slightly, his sharp features betraying a flicker of interest. Claire didn't wait for a response. She locked eyes with Carter, her hazel gaze unwavering, her fair skin flushed with determination. "Do you really think my father wanted this? That he chose to be here, fighting for the house where we've lived our entire lives? Do you think he wanted to see his children go to bed scared that they'd have nowhere to wake up in the morning?" Carter, visibly caught off guard, hesitated. His smirk faltered, and he glanced down at his clipboard as if searching for a scripted rebuttal. But Claire wasn't finished. "My dad didn't fail because he was reckless or irresponsible. He failed because the system failed him. Because when he needed help the most, the people with power turned their backs." Her voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating conviction that demanded to be heard. George Miller, seated beside her, looked at his daughter with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. The 45-year-old man, with his graying brown hair and tired blue eyes, seemed to shrink and expand all at once, shrinking under the weight of his guilt but expanding with pride at the strength his daughter was showing. His hands, resting on the table, trembled slightly as he resisted the urge to reach out and pull her into a hug. In the gallery, the spectators were no longer whispering. A middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair, who had earlier dismissed Claire as a child playing dress-up, now sat wide-eyed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Beside her, a young man about 25 years old with dark brown skin and short curls nodded subtly, his expression one of growing admiration. Judge Thompson, a 55-year-old black man with dark brown skin and short gray hair, leaned back slightly in his chair. His clean-shaven face, typically stoic, now showed a faint crease of curiosity. His hands, which had been resting folded on the bench, moved to his lap, his fingers tapping lightly against one another as he considered Claire's words. Carter finally regained his composure, straightening his posture and clearing his throat. "Ms. Miller," he began, his tone still condescending but now tinged with defensiveness. "I understand this is an emotional situation for you, but the law is based on facts, not feelings. Your father's inability to make his payments—" Claire cut him off. "The law is supposed to protect people," she said, her voice rising slightly, her youthful face flushed with emotion. "Not punish them for trying to survive." Another ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery, louder this time. Even the bailiff, a 50-year-old white man with short-cropped brown hair, glanced briefly at the judge as if wondering whether he should step in. But Judge Thompson held up a hand, silencing the room without saying a word. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his deep voice resonating with authority. "Ms. Miller has the floor. Let her continue." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line as he sat back down, his pale face betraying a flicker of irritation. Claire took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she steadied herself. She glanced briefly at her father, drawing strength from his quiet presence, before turning her gaze back to the judge. "My dad didn't want this," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "He's not a criminal. He's a man who's done everything he can to take care of his family. And I'm here because someone has to tell his side of the story." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Judge Thompson regarded her carefully, his dark brown eyes narrowing slightly as though he were looking for something beneath the surface. Whatever he saw, it was enough to make him nod, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for the faint shift in his otherwise impassive expression. "Proceed, Ms. Miller," he said, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. As Claire resumed speaking, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. What had started as a spectacle, an inexperienced child taking on a case far beyond her years, had transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't just a young girl defending her father. This was a fight for justice, for dignity, and for hope. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom was still, save for the faint rustle of paper as Claire Miller, standing firmly behind the defendant's table, reached into her overstuffed folder. The 14-year-old's fair hands moved with purpose, her long, chestnut-brown ponytail brushing against her light blue cardigan as she retrieved a set of neatly printed documents. The gallery watched in stunned silence, their earlier skepticism replaced by a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "My father was denied a fair opportunity," Claire began, her voice steady and clear despite her youth. She placed the papers on the table with a deliberate precision that spoke of countless hours of preparation. According to Section 158 of the Loan Fairness Act, enacted in 2002, the bank was obligated to offer a loan restructuring program before initiating foreclosure proceedings. They failed to do so. A ripple of murmurs broke the silence as heads turned and whispers passed through the audience. Some leaned toward their neighbors, exchanging incredulous glances. Even the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, a 40-year-old white man with pale skin, slicked-back blonde hair, and a tailored navy suit, froze in place. His confident smirk faded into a frown as he quickly flipped through the pages on his legal pad, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Judge Harry Thompson, a 55-year-old black man with dark brown skin and short, neatly trimmed gray hair, leaned forward for the first time. His sharp, clean-shaven face, typically stoic and unyielding, now betrayed a flicker of genuine interest. His hands, which had been resting idly on the bench, clasped together as he scrutinized the young girl before him. "Ms. Miller," he said, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. "Are you certain of this statute's relevance to the case at hand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Claire replied without hesitation. Her hazel eyes locked onto his, unwavering and filled with a quiet determination. She picked up the document she had prepared, stepping closer to the bench as she held it out. "Here is the statute, along with similar case precedents from the past 10 years. The bank failed to comply with their legal obligation to explore restructuring options, which could have prevented this foreclosure." The courtroom fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. George Miller, her 45-year-old father, sat beside her, his pale skin flushed with a mixture of pride and disbelief. His short, graying brown hair was slightly disheveled, and his tired blue eyes filled with moisture as he watched his daughter take control of a situation that had once seemed hopeless. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the document she had provided. The creak of his leather chair was the only sound in the room as he read, his brows furrowing deeper with each passing second. "It appears," he finally said, his tone measured but tinged with surprise, "that Ms. Miller has brought forward a valid and compelling argument." Another wave of murmurs swept through the gallery, louder this time. A middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly, dark brown hair, who had initially dismissed Claire as out of her depth, now leaned forward with wide eyes. A young man, about 25 years old with dark brown skin and short curls, nodded slowly, his arms crossed as he observed the scene with growing admiration. Mr. Carter, meanwhile, stood abruptly, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slightly strained, "while the statute Ms. Miller cites is technically accurate, the specifics of this case—" "Mr. Carter," Judge Thompson interrupted, his sharp tone cutting through the attorney's protest. "The court will consider her argument in its entirety. If the bank failed to meet its legal obligations, then we have a serious issue to address." Carter's jaw tightened, and he sank back into his seat, his pale face a shade paler. He quickly scribbled notes, occasionally glancing up at Claire with thinly veiled frustration. Claire, unfazed by the opposition, continued. "Your Honor, the law was designed to protect people like my father, hard-working individuals who fall on hard times through no fault of their own. The bank ignored this law, choosing to pursue foreclosure instead of offering him a chance to recover. This isn't just about my family. It's about holding them accountable for breaking the rules." The room felt electric, charged with the gravity of what she had just said. Judge Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative as he regarded the young girl before him. "Ms. Miller," he said after a long pause, "your preparation and understanding of the law are remarkable, especially for someone your age." Claire nodded respectfully, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. George Miller, sitting beside her, could barely contain his emotions. His hands, rough and calloused from years of factory work, clenched tightly together as he looked at his daughter with awe. She had taken the weight of his failure and transformed it into a weapon of hope. In the gallery, the spectators were no longer skeptics. They were witnesses to something extraordinary. A 14-year-old girl, armed with little more than determination and a pile of papers, had just shaken the foundations of a case that had seemed unwinnable. Judge Thompson set the document down and adjusted his glasses once more. "Very well," he said, his voice firm. The court will proceed with this new information in mind. Ms. Miller, you may continue your presentation." As Claire returned to her seat, her small hands trembling slightly as she organized her papers, the gallery erupted in low whispers again. Not of doubt this time, but of astonishment. She had not only held her ground, but had shifted the momentum of the case entirely. For the first time since the trial began, hope filled the room. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was there, in the way the spectators leaned forward, in the softened expression on Judge Thompson's face, and in the way George Miller sat a little taller, the weight of despair slowly lifting from his shoulders. Claire had done what no one thought possible. She made them believe. The air in the courtroom grew thick with an almost palpable tension as Claire Miller continued to present her case. At just 14 years old, she stood behind the defendant's table with a composure that no one had anticipated. Her long chestnut-brown ponytail swayed slightly each time she turned a page in her folder, her small hands moving with precision as she referenced documents and pointed to specific passages. Despite her youthful appearance, her fair skin, the light blue cardigan she wore over a plain white blouse, and her modest navy skirt, Claire commanded the room with the confidence of someone far older. The gallery, once buzzing with skepticism and quiet chuckles, now sat in utter silence. Many of the spectators had come expecting a spectacle, a child fumbling through legal jargon in a hopeless attempt to defend her father. But what they witnessed was something entirely different. Claire's voice, steady and clear, echoed across the room as she methodically broke down the case against her father, George Miller. George, a 45-year-old man with graying brown hair and tired blue eyes, sat beside her, his worn gray suit hanging loosely on his thin frame. His hands rested on the table, trembling slightly as he watched his daughter. The weight of guilt and helplessness that had burdened him throughout the trial seemed to lift with each word Claire spoke. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope. "According to the Loan Fairness Act," Claire said, her hazel eyes scanning the room, "the bank had a legal obligation to offer a restructuring plan before initiating foreclosure. Not only did they fail to do so, but they also ignored multiple requests for assistance from my father. This isn't just negligence, it's a violation of the law." The room hung on her every word. In the gallery, a middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair leaned forward, her earlier skepticism replaced by genuine interest. Beside her, a younger man, about 25 years old, with dark brown skin and short curls, nodded slightly in silent agreement. It was clear that Claire's words resonated with many in the audience. Some of them, no doubt, had faced similar struggles, lost jobs, mounting bills, and the looming threat of losing everything. Claire wasn't just speaking for her father, she was speaking for them. Even the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, couldn't mask his discomfort. A 40-year-old white man with slicked-back blonde hair and a tailored navy suit, Carter had entered the courtroom exuding confidence, certain that his legal prowess would make quick work of the case. But now, his pale face was flushed, and he shuffled through his papers with increasing urgency. The once smug smirk that had lingered on his lips was long gone, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. Claire turned to face Carter directly, her expression calm but resolute. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "you've argued that my father's financial difficulties were entirely his fault, that he should have known better when he took out those loans. But let me ask you this. If someone is drowning, do we blame them for not swimming fast enough, or do we help them out of the water?" A soft gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a murmur of approval. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, clearly unsure how to counter such a simple yet devastating analogy. Judge Harry Thompson, a 55-year-old black man with dark brown skin and short, neatly trimmed gray hair, watched the exchange with keen interest. Known for his stern demeanor and impartiality, Thompson rarely betrayed his thoughts during proceedings. But now, he leaned forward slightly, his clean-shaven face illuminated by the warm overhead lighting. His sharp eyes flicked between Claire and Carter, as though silently weighing the merits of each argument. Claire continued, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "My father didn't ask for this. He didn't choose to lose his job or to face a system that prioritizes profits over people. All he wanted was a chance to provide for his family. And instead of helping him, the bank chose to ignore its own legal responsibilities." The gallery was no longer just an audience. They were witnesses to something extraordinary. Claire's words, though delivered by a teenager, carried the weight of lived experience and undeniable truth. She wasn't just presenting a legal argument. She was telling a story that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. George's eyes filled with tears as he listened to his daughter. The 45-year-old man, who had spent months feeling like a failure, now saw himself through Claire's eyes. Not as someone defeated, but as someone worth fighting for. His hands, once trembling, now rested steady on the table as he sat a little taller in his seat. Carter, meanwhile, seemed to shrink with every passing moment. He flipped through his notes in search of a rebuttal, but his movements were frantic, lacking the confidence he'd displayed earlier. For the first time, he looked like a man on the defensive, cornered by an opponent he had underestimated. Judge Thompson finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Ms. Miller," he said, his tone measured, "you've made some compelling arguments. However, I must ask, do you have evidence to support your claims regarding the bank's negligence?" Claire nodded, her hazel eyes meeting the judge's without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, pulling another document from her folder. "This is a copy of the correspondence my father sent to the bank, requesting a restructuring plan. They never responded." The judge took the document and studied it carefully, his expression unreadable. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as everyone waited for his reaction. Finally, he looked up, his sharp features softening just slightly. "This is substantial," he said, setting the document down. "The court will take it into consideration." A wave of relief washed over George, and a faint smile appeared on Claire's face. A small but significant victory. In the gallery, spectators exchanged murmurs of approval, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration for the young girl who had turned the tide of the case. For the first time, it felt as though the courtroom was no longer just a stage for a legal battle. It had become a platform for something much greater, a testament to resilience, determination, and the power of a voice that refused to be silenced. Claire, though small in stature, had made herself impossible to ignore. The courtroom fell into an almost unbearable silence as Judge Harry Thompson leaned back in his chair, his dark brown eyes scanning the room with the weight of the decision he was about to deliver. The spectators, attorneys, and even the bailiff sat motionless, their anticipation thickening the air. For what felt like an eternity, only the faint ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard. At the defendant's table, Claire Miller stood beside her father, her small hands resting on the edge of the table for balance. Despite her 14 years, she held herself with remarkable composure, though her hazel eyes betrayed the anxiety she tried so hard to hide. Her light blue cardigan, slightly wrinkled from hours of sitting, seemed to emphasize her youth, but the determination etched into her face made it clear she was anything but ordinary. Beside her, George Miller sat with his head bowed, his pale, weathered hands clasped tightly in front of him. The 45-year-old man's graying brown hair looked disheveled, and his loose gray suit hung awkwardly on his thin frame, but his expression carried a mix of hope and exhaustion. Months of sleepless nights and overwhelming guilt had led to this moment, and his daughter's relentless fight had brought him closer to salvation than he'd thought possible. Judge Thompson, a 55-year-old black man with dark brown skin and short, neatly trimmed gray hair, finally broke the silence. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench, his hands clasped together. His clean-shaven face was stern, but there was a subtle softness in his tone as he began to speak. "This case has presented unique challenges," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "On one hand, we have the facts. Mr. George Miller defaulted on his loan payments, which led to the foreclosure proceedings initiated by the bank. On the other hand, we have the law, and the evidence presented today shows that the bank did not fulfill its legal obligation to offer loan restructuring before pursuing foreclosure." A murmur rippled through the gallery, the spectators leaning forward in their seats as they processed his words. Claire's hands gripped the table tighter, her knuckles whitening as she held her breath. "Claire Miller," Judge Thompson continued, his sharp gaze resting on the young girl who had stood before the court with courage far beyond her years. "Your arguments were not only well prepared, but also deeply impactful. You reminded this court of something we too often forget, that the law exists to protect, not to punish, those who are struggling." The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. For a moment, even the opposing attorney, Mr. Carter, looked subdued, his pale face flushed and his slicked-back blonde hair slightly out of place as he stared down at the notes he had so confidently prepared at the trial's start. Judge Thompson straightened in his chair, his hands resting firmly on the bench. "This court orders the bank to reassess Mr. Miller's loan under fairer terms, in compliance with the Loan Fairness Act. Furthermore, part of the charges brought against him are hereby dismissed." The words hung in the air for a brief moment before the room erupted. Applause broke out from the gallery, a spontaneous and unrestrained expression of relief and approval. The spectators who had once doubted Claire were now cheering for her, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration. A middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair wiped a tear from her eye as she clapped, her expression one of genuine respect. Beside her, a young man with dark brown skin and short curls smiled broadly, nodding in agreement. Even the bailiff, a 50-year-old white man with a stocky build and cropped brown hair, allowed a faint smile to tug at the corners of his lips, making no effort to suppress the crowd's reaction. At the defendant's table, George Miller let out a shaky breath, his tired blue eyes glistening with tears he no longer tried to hide. He turned to his daughter, his voice catching as he whispered, "You did it, Claire." Claire, for the first time that day, allowed herself to relax. Her hazel eyes, which had been so focused and intense throughout the trial, softened with emotion. A small, relieved smile broke across her face as she looked up at her father. "We did it, Dad," she said, her voice barely audible over the applause. Judge Thompson, though typically unshaken by displays of emotion in his courtroom, allowed the applause to continue for a few moments before raising a hand for quiet. The room gradually settled, though the sense of triumph lingered in the air. "Claire Miller," the judge said, his tone softer now, "what you've done here today is nothing short of remarkable. Your dedication to justice and your family is a testament to the power of resilience and determination. I commend you." Claire's cheeks flushed, and she nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions she was feeling. As the proceedings officially concluded and the courtroom began to empty, spectators approached George and Claire to offer their congratulations. Strangers who had once doubted her now shook her hand, praising her courage and intelligence. Outside the courtroom, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the father and daughter as they stepped into the fresh air. George pulled Claire into a tight embrace, his voice breaking as he said, "I'm so proud of you." Claire smiled through tears, her chest rising and falling as she finally let go of the tension she had been carrying. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. "You did more than help," George replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "You gave us a second chance." And as they stood there, surrounded by the hum of life continuing around them, it was clear that Claire Miller's courage had not only changed the course of her family's future, but had also left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed her fight for justice. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, letting the late afternoon sun flood the steps outside. Claire Miller emerged first, clutching her overstuffed folder to her chest. The 14-year-old looked smaller than ever against the towering stone facade of the courthouse, but the expression on her face told a different story. Her hazel eyes glistened with tears of relief, and her shoulders, tense for so long, finally relaxed. The cool breeze brushed through her chestnut-brown ponytail, carrying away the weight of the fight she had just endured. Behind her, George Miller stepped out, his tired blue eyes squinting against the sunlight. The 45-year-old man, with his disheveled, graying brown hair and ill-fitting gray suit, looked as though he'd aged years in the past few hours. But as he caught sight of his daughter standing there, her back straight and her face glowing with quiet triumph, the lines of worry softened. For the first time in months, perhaps even years, George felt a flicker of hope. Not the fragile kind that teeters on the edge of doubt, but the kind that roots itself deep and refuses to let go. "Claire," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion as he stepped toward her. She turned to him, and in an instant, the carefully maintained composure she had worn throughout the trial shattered. Tears spilled down her fair cheeks as she dropped the folder and threw her arms around her father. George pulled her close, his rough hands trembling slightly as they rested on her back. "You were incredible," he said, his voice breaking. "Absolutely incredible." Claire shook her head against his shoulder, her words muffled by emotion. "I just didn't want us to lose everything, Dad. I couldn't let them take it all away." George pulled back slightly to look at her, his tired blue eyes brimming with pride and gratitude. "You didn't just save our home," he said softly. "You reminded me what it means to fight, to believe that we can still win even when the odds are stacked against us." Around them, the courthouse steps were bustling with activity. People who had been in the courtroom lingered nearby, talking in hushed tones about what they had just witnessed. A middle-aged woman with tan skin and curly dark brown hair, who had earlier dismissed Claire as an overconfident child, now looked at her with admiration. She wiped at her eyes with a tissue before turning to the person beside her and murmuring, "That girl, she's something special." A younger man, about 25 years old with dark brown skin and short curls, nodded in agreement. "She's not just smart," he said, his tone full of respect. "She's brave. Not many people could do what she just did, let alone someone her age." Claire noticed the quiet attention but felt too overwhelmed to acknowledge it. She clung to her father for a moment longer before stepping back and wiping her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her light blue cardigan. Despite the exhaustion etched into her features, there was a small, triumphant smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The atmosphere outside the courthouse felt lighter, almost as if the weight of the day had lifted for everyone who had been inside. Reporters had gathered at the bottom of the steps, their cameras and microphones poised as they called out to Claire and her father. "Claire, how does it feel to have won the case? Mr. Miller, what do you have to say about your daughter's incredible defense? Claire, what inspired you to take on such a huge responsibility at just 14? George hesitated, glancing at his daughter to see if she wanted to respond, but Claire shook her head gently. "Not yet," she whispered. He nodded in understanding, then stepped forward and raised a hand. "We appreciate your interest," he said, his voice still unsteady. "But right now, we just want to go home. Please respect that." The reporters exchanged glances but backed off slightly, their questions trailing into murmurs. George turned back to Claire, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Let's go," he said softly. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, hand in hand, the buzz of conversation swirled around them. News of the case spread rapidly, carried by witnesses, reporters, and even courthouse staff. People talked about the girl who had taken on a system designed to overwhelm and intimidate, who had stood up not just for her father, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against forces larger than themselves. By the time George and Claire reached their car, the magnitude of what had just happened began to settle in. Claire slid into the passenger seat, her hands still trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. George sat beside her, gripping the steering wheel but not yet starting the engine. He turned to her, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "Claire," he said, shaking his head with a faint smile, "you know they're going to be talking about this for a long time." Claire let out a soft laugh, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "I don't care about that, Dad. I just care that we're going to be okay." George's smile widened, and he reached over to ruffle her hair, something he hadn't done in years. "We will be, kiddo," he said. "Thanks to you." As the car pulled away from the courthouse, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets. Inside, father and daughter sat in comfortable silence, the enormity of their victory wrapping around them like a protective blanket. What Claire had done that day would ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Her courage, determination, and unshakable belief in justice had not only saved her family, but had inspired countless others to believe that even the smallest voice could echo loudly in the halls of power. It was a day no one who witnessed it would ever forget. And for Claire and George, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with hope, resilience, and the knowledge that together they could face anything.